I'm not into clickbaity titles. United States dollars have been funding terrorism. And no, I'm not talking about the fact that we're propping up the Taliban government in Afghanistan. Yeah, the one that killed thousands of US soldiers by us currently striking their enemies in Afghanistan. And I'm also not talking about how an ex-ISIS leader who fought US forces in Iraq recently visited the White House. No, those topics will be future videos. What I am talking about is something closer to home, a scandal that illustrates how millions of United States tax dollars were given to terrorist organizations in a multi-million-dollar fraud pyramid. If you've watched my videos before, I'm a Midwest boy. That's where my public speaking events happen, and that's where I've lived since I've been in the States. So this video especially hits home because it pertains to a state that is 15 minutes away from my city, Minnesota. There are a lot of Muslims in Minnesota, and not just the falafel peddling kind. Some are quite radical. In fact, I've got Muslim relatives in Minnesota. Relatives that I no longer visit because of their increasingly radical political takes that would make many of you shudder. Last time my wife and I visited these relatives, they brought up the Israel-Palestine conflict, and one of my cousins stated that she believed Mr. Adolf got something right, indicating that she supported the systematic genocide of the Jewish race. This radicalism alarmed me, and it really bothered my wife. This was coming from a Muslim person who had grown up their entire life in the United States. This person hated America, hated the state of Israel, and supported groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, groups whose entire existence is predicated upon the destruction of the West. There are hundreds of thousands of people like this in the state of Minnesota. Recently, the group that has been highlighted has been Somalis. And they've just kind of strode into Minnesota and said,
I'm the captain now.
Maybe you know where I'm going with this story, maybe you don't. But let me give you guys a super short synopsis of exactly why people are leaving Somalia. The Somali government is extremely weak. So weak, in fact, that they have three governments. The Somali government, a group that broke off from the Somali government and started their own country called Somaliland, and another breakaway country called Puntland, which doesn't recognize the authority of the main Somali government. These groups are all fighting a civil war, not only against each other, but against tribal groups and terrorist organizations that own the rest of Somalia. One of those terrorist organizations I'm quite familiar with, as its leadership originates from my country, ISIS. Yes, ISIS has a branch in Somalia led by this guy, who for the purposes of our video, we will call Pumpkin. If you want to know his real name, I'll put it in the description below. Which, here's a fun fact. ISIS guys have two beard colors, either black or this stupid-ass shade of bright orange, which seems to be the only color ISIS members dye their beards. I've seen ISIS fighters in Iraq do this during my time there, and I never really understood the trend, but it's definitely an OG ISIS member thing to do. The second and most prominent terrorist group in Somalia is known as Shabaab, which is not only actively fighting the government of Somalia, but also fights with ISIS, because ISIS and Al-Qaeda fight like cats and dogs, and Al-Shabaab is affiliated with Al-Qaeda. If you ever want me to cover the reason behind the beef between ISIS and Al-Qaeda, let me know in the comments section. But you can imagine that Somalia isn't the nicest or safest place to live, so a lot of people look to leave Somalia. And for one reason or another, many of them end up in the land of 10,000 lakes. And like my Iraqi cousin, many of those fleeing Somalia aren't particularly fond of the place they fled to. And the logic makes sense if you think about it. You fled one country that radical Islam turned into hell on earth. So after fleeing it, you adhere to your radical Islamic beliefs in America, which is much better than the place you fled from because, actually, no, it doesn't make sense. But maybe it does if subconsciously they're homesick and they want to turn America into the third world mess hole that they fled from. Yes, mess hole. I'm trying not to swear, guys. Either way, there are many Somalis in Minnesota, and they figured out that the federal government loves to just hand out money to people who don't deserve it. There are a lot of other people who have researched this better than I have, But the gist of it was Somalis applied for a bunch of federal aid money for bogus nonprofits. The government of Minnesota was like, what are you guys going to do with hundreds of millions of dollars? We need to have some sort of account of where this is going. And the Somalis were like, listen, it's 2020. And even though we slaughter each other by the thousands back home, here in America, Black Lives Matter. So guess what? Either you guys give us the money or we sue you for being racist. And the state of Minnesota was like, guess I can't argue with that. That makes perfect sense. Here you be.
This entire scheme started back in 2020 because of one organization, and that organization was called Feeding Our Future. And Feeding Our Future was the largest nonprofit recipient of government funds in Minneapolis during the pandemic. And what this organization allegedly did was they partnered with local businesses and organizations to feed hungry families. And these organizations and businesses, they volunteered themselves as feeding sites. And the government would then reimburse Feeding Our Future for giving out all of this food. Except, here's the thing. They weren't actually feeding children. I'm gonna pull out my iPad here to read this to you guys. This is from the New York Times. State agencies reimbursed the group and its partners for invoices claiming to have fed tens of thousands of children. In reality, actually it's more than tens of thousands, you're gonna see that soon too. In reality, federal prosecutors said most of the meals were non-existent, and business owners spent the funds on luxury cars, houses, and even real estate projects abroad. Abroad. I wonder where.
And now, as I'm sure you've seen, unprecedented fraud has taken place in the state of Minnesota, specifically among the Somali community. This hasn't been a secret. It's been national news.
Somalians ripped off that state for billions of dollars. Their country stinks.
Here's the kicker, though. Millions of dollars have been funneled back into Somalia, specifically to the main terrorist organization, Shabaab, an al-Qaeda-affiliated organization that has murdered Americans. This goes beyond simple negligence on the state of Minnesota's part. And here's the deal. I know a lot of people in Minnesota. For my boys and girls in Minnesota, share this video and please call your local representatives. Beyond Tim Walz needing to be held accountable for this, if it were anyone else who negligently funneled millions of dollars directly into the hands of a terrorist organization, they would absolutely be held to account. This guy shouldn't get a pass because he's a politician. In fact, Tim Walz should be held to a higher standard. This guy could have been our vice president. Are we gonna stand for this, America? Share this and let's get this guy where he belongs, a federal prison. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more conservative political commentary from me, do me a favor and subscribe and hit that bell icon to stay tuned for future videos. And if you're curious about what my content is all about, I do have a content library in the description below. Until next time, Muzzy.